We have a very interesting story for you today, and it's not about video games, but the world of comic books, and how one comic book was recently censored. Marvel Comics has censored King Conan #2, which is a revival of the Conan comics, following accusations of Native American cultural appropriation. This article was written by Spencer Bakuli at boundingintocomics.com. So here's a cover from the new Conan comic, and as you can see, you have a Native American woman here who is pretty scantily clad, and you can also see, there were other panels with her wearing the same outfit. And a lot of people found this to be offensive because of the fact that, she's supposed to be a Native American woman, and she's named after an extremely significant Native American woman, but also because it was pretty sexualized, right? Here's an image where we can see the before and after, because they've completely changed the character's design now. And this is like half of the issue, right? Is that she was pretty hypersexualized.
She is hypersexualized, but she is also guilty of a little cultural appropriation.
Right, the feathers in the headdress was something specifically mentioned by Native Americans who found this offensive.
Definitely the clothing or lack thereof, I feel, is extreme. It looks like a bad Halloween costume.
A bad Halloween costume? I'm pretty sure if Doja Cat wore this, everybody would think it was a good Halloween costume.
Times are changing. Ariana Grande just got called out for her cultural appropriation.
I meant more because of the amount of skin she's showing. Obviously, the cultural appropriation, that's kind of inarguable here. And that's especially so because the biggest thing was they changed her name. Because the author of this comic, Jason Aaron, he named her after actually the historical figure Pocahontas, but he didn't name her Pocahontas. He actually named her Madawaska, which was a name that the historical figure Pocahontas used later in life, but only amongst close friends. And the name means like eldest or beloved daughter.
That does feel a little intrusive to use the actual name of somebody as significant as Pocahontas.
Right, well, as one Twitter user said,
"This is sexualization of a real young girl that was raped and killed young. Affects our murdered and missing indigenous women today. You are backwards, sick, and should donate every penny you earn creating this to MMIW."
Which is obviously like a group that focuses on Native American women's issues. So yeah, I mean, Pocahontas, if you think about what happened with all that, like, it's not a charming story of a Native American girl who falls in love with a white man. It's the story of a woman who was abducted from her people and basically like put on display in England as like an example of white people, quote unquote, taming savages. So it's pretty horrible. To actively reference that and like totally take that out of context is pretty inappropriate, especially considering that the author was a white man.
Yeah, it seems like they just didn't care to consider the history behind it at all, or consider Native American people. And when writing a story and you have a character that is Native American, I just feel like you should have done that.
Yeah, because of these kinds of criticisms, this design was changed out for this design, which, obviously a lot more toned down. And my thing is, like, I think totally they should have changed her name, and I understand changing her, like, culturally appropriative, like, headdress as well is pretty important. It's the hypersexualization part that I at first thought, well, that's not that big of a deal. But as I looked further into this, like, I think like sexuality is not something you have to shy away from. And depicting women even in sexual ways or not wearing a ton of clothing, like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But context matters. And the context in this situation is a lot deeper than you might think. Now, obviously, there are tons of people, men and women, because we all know that if you've watched The Handmaid's Tale, there are plenty of women who will help oppress other women. Now, obviously, people are going to say, oh, well, in Conan, like, all of the different cultures represented are fictional, and they're all based on different cultures from around the world, so, you know, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. However, I think if you really even, like, barely look into it, you'll see that the non-white cultures are typically not depicted in the same way as the white ones, and they're definitely depicted in more negative ways.
To represent any group of people in a way that just perpetuates stereotypes is a bad thing. Obviously.
But in this situation, it's not just a bad thing. It's actually dangerous, and we'll get to that. Here's the actual apology from Jason Aaron, the writer. In Conan number 3, I made the ill-considered decision to give a character the name of Madawaska, a name most closely associated with the real-life Native American figure Pocahontas. This new character is a supernatural 1,000-year-old princess of a cursed island within a world of pastiche and dark fantasy, and was never intended to be based on anyone from history. I like how he's like, you know, this is clearly a fantasy world, but, like, you named her after a real person, so, like, it's your fault. Like, people aren't, like, going out of their way to call you out. I feel like that was a little, like, you know, he tried to say, oh, but because of the setting, but...
No, if you gave her the name of the real-life Pocahontas and also, like, designed her in a way that's, like, obvious that she's supposed to be Native American,
right.
Like, you did that.
I should have better understood the name's true meaning and resonance and recognized it wasn't appropriate to use it. I understand the outrage expressed by those who hold the true Madawaka's legacy dear, and for all of this and the distress it's caused, I apologize, as he should. As part of that apology, I've already taken what I was paid for the issue and donated it to the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. The character's name and appearance will be adjusted for the rest of this miniseries and an all-digital and collected edition. So he actually even did what that one woman said, which was he should donate his proceeds because he is profiteering off of, you know, appropriating Pocahontas, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, it sounds like he just did the right thing, which is rare, but good.
Now, some people are saying it's still a hypersexualized, demeaning, misogynistic stereotype of an indigenous woman. This doesn't let Aaron or Marvel off the hook. I think that's honestly ridiculous because they did tone down the hypersexualization. Like, her new outfit is very covering. Like, Conan's outfit was already surprisingly covering because I just remember him wearing like a loincloth back in the day. But like, now the woman's covered too, okay? So like, nobody should be upset about that. I don't even know if necessarily that was the biggest issue, except for the connotation, which we'll get to. Now, other people say that Aaron has a record of respectfully representing American minorities, including Native Americans in Scalped. That's right, guys. This is actually not Aaron's first time writing about Native Americans. In fact, he had a 60-issue comic book about Native Americans titled Scalp, which, you know, I've written actually recently a comic book idea and it has scalping involved. But I would never imagine to like put that as the name. It's just kind of a bad connotation. Like right off the bat, like I don't know anything about the series and we'll get into what the series is about and like, but that just is not a positive thing to associate Native Americans with, especially when history tells us and documentation shows that it was mostly white people who were having natives scalped. So to use that as like a reference, I don't know if they cover that in the comic or if he elucidates that, but there you go. That's the reality for anyone who was unaware. So let's take a look at that. Scalped. This is a comic book by this guy, Aaron, Jason Aaron. Now here's a scene that one person on Twitter found to be pretty powerful. Now, Scalped is a noir detective drama that is also kind of a western that takes place on a reservation, and the main character is a Native American man who grew up in an impoverished neighborhood on the reservation. He leaves home, becomes an FBI agent, and then returns home to the reservation to solve crimes for the FBI. That's the plot of Scalped, right? Which is honestly a really interesting, intriguing, and could be very three-dimensional way to look at life on reservations and the impact of colonialism and the impact of, you know, the genocide that was committed against Native Americans. Paul Lay at Multiversity Comics says, sprawling sagas of place and question of race, reflections on Scalped. They say, playing Indian in American pop culture is a practice with a gut-wrenching history, one intimately tied with rationalizing and even romanticizing material dispossession and symbolic removal of peoples. Numerous scholars have pointed out the complicity of non-native cultural constructions of American Indians, a profoundly troubling history of settler colonization, exploitation, and ghettoization, and it has been argued genocide. I mean, like I just said, genocide. Like, you don't even have to say argued, bro. Are you freaking kidding me? Some will bristle at this kind of race talk in a piece about a comic book. LMAO, back in 2015, things were not very politicized. Like, wow. That's crazy that they, like, even have a line to be like, no, I know this is quite political discussion.
Back then, they didn't care as much.
Others bristled the moment the word scalped showed up in the title. Yeah, no, I'm sure Native Americans don't fucking like that. Some would be disturbed that Aaron writes these Oglala Lakota embroiled in violence, criminality, alcoholism, drug addiction, intragroup exploitation, family dissolution, and illicit sexuality. Someone might say that, oh, well, he's just trying to show the gritty, dark underbelly that is part of the, you know, and is part of the genre. But as the author says, if these were white characters, they would be killing and shooting and criminal empiring just the same. Surely red facing is just missing the point if you're saying that, right? They do say, though, that, you know, Aaron's work can often be read as subverting stereotypes.
This article also talks about Orientalism, the exoticizing of the magical, mysterious, foreign, savage, and primal other that became how the Imperial West saw the East.
Vital to the Western self-imagination as adventurer, as civilized explorer, even as disenchanted wanderer, wide-eyed before a wild frontier, was the construction of these strange and beautiful races. The yellow and brown, and by the time of this image transforms into pulps, blue and tentacle alien peoples, all their allures, their spices, their danger. Flip the compass's directions and you have how American Manifest Destiny could romanticize and butcher the westward Native American. Now, if you want me to simplify that, right, because they are very verbose, this writer. They're saying the way that white people view people of other races is very, like, infantilizing, and not only that, but like dehumanizing. Like, they're seen as like one with or a part of nature, where white people are part of civilization. I can't be sure Aaron is signaling these resonances, but the book's hard-boiled cynicism suggests we're not meant to read the reference in total earnest, which means like maybe Aaron's poking fun at this, right, in like a meta kind of way.
Right, like maybe he's trying to call out these issues and these stereotypes by presenting them in such a way that's in your face.
Perhaps this character is reflecting on this quote because he thinks it's so bad and like, wow, like they really thought this shit about us, you know, as opposed to like, you know, buying in. Now, obviously, this writer had a lot of, you know, respect and praise to talk about when talking about Scalped, and it sounds like, you know, this was an attempt to do something deep and meaningful and that would shine a light on some of the issues that Native American people face. However, it's also done, again, from a white man's perspective to the benefit of a white man, and is used to perpetuate stereotypes, even if they're, like, you know, shown to be skin deep and these characters are developed later, they still do play upon all these same things that are problematic. But let's hear from an actual native person. So, you know, it's hard to say if Scalped was problematic or not, but, you know, it's kind of interesting that this is a man who has done work in, you know, done creative work involving Native Americans in the past, and work that was not necessarily considered outright terrible. This situation, though, was really bad and basic. Like, it sounds like Scalped was complex and three-dimensional, but this is like a basic, this girl is brown, so we put her in skimpy tribal outfit type situation. So let's look at what one Native American person had to say about this.
Alina Pete says the Conan Pocahontas thing is stomach-turningly awful for many reasons I hope I don't have to explain to you. Sexualizing indigenous women, using the name of a murdered child for your big titty exoticism character. But I want to talk for a moment about Jason Aaron, who wrote this arc.
He's a white guy from Alabama who got a lot of critical acclaim for the series Scalped, the title of which already should be ringing alarm bells for most of you. Yeah, that is alarming. A white dude from Alabama who is, profiting already just by being a white dude in Alabama off of the destruction of Native American society is naming a book Scalped. How great.
She says, in this series, the protagonist ran away from his terrible life of poverty and hopelessness on the reservation, but now is back to be a noir detective and solve crimes. Whatever, fine.
Yeah, she doesn't take issue with the premise, basically. That's fine.
And she even says, in the right hands, it could even be a really interesting, nuanced story, something that examines themes of desperation, being disconnected from the community you left, etc. I understand Aaron even tried to do some of this in his noir tale.
So there you go. She's already giving credit where credit is due and saying it looks like in many respects he did attempt to give an earnest representation.
But fundamentally this story is poverty porn. It's not an examination of the systematic problems that Native people face. It's a chance for the author to go, wow, look at how up the reservations are. Isn't that dark and gritty? This is why we need Native voices writing Native characters. We're not showpieces to make your world even more noir. We're not here for you to make money off our murders and suicides, even fictional ones.
Because again, even if he is trying to do it in a respectful, nice way, it's kind of horrible to profit off of Native American suffering when white people do that all day, every day already, just by existing here. She ends it saying, F Jason Aaron for making money and a career off of our suffering and anyone else who does the same. One more thing I want to talk about is that Native American women experience sexual assault at a high rate, and depictions of Native American women in these hypersexualized ways, such as in this comic book, they contribute to that. So in this situation, I don't think hypersexualizing women is okay. Because you're doing it to an extremely underrepresented group, A, and B, this is an extremely vulnerable group that can be harmed by what you're doing.
I feel like this is obvious why it's problematic, because not only is it harmful to real indigenous women, it just perpetuates these terrible stereotypes as well. It's not original, it's derivative in the most offensive way.
Conan the Barbarian is a really interesting comic book because, it's all about super masculine dudes and super feminine damsel in distress type women. And there's no place for those kinds of stories, but for us to move on as a society towards a more equal future, they cannot be the stories that we hold up as paragons of how we should live our lives. Frank Frazetta is an extremely famous fantasy artist who made all of this beautiful art that you're seeing now. He made this, which is the Death Dealer, which is an extremely famous and, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful images of fantasy art. He's also famous for his art regarding Conan. And in fact, this picture of Conan is based on his famous Death Dealer. He's also famous for his very striking anatomical depictions of not only men, but obviously women as well. I remember growing up, actually, my mom, she had art books, and a lot of them were of this art style, and about drawing the human body and the human form and musculature and stuff like that. And Frank Frazetta was pasted all over those books, and she was a huge fan of his. So I'm not saying that this is horrible for women and all women hate this, and in fact you can see this is really beautiful art. Many of his pieces are even empowering. And it's fair to say that he was a massive influence on Conan and a lot of pop culture. But his depictions of minorities and his depictions of people of color were sometimes strikingly horrible, strikingly demeaning. This is a piece that he did for a Tarzan novel. And you can see some of the worst stereotypes about Africans on display here. Not to mention the callous murdering of Africans in a joyous representation that is obviously meant to inspire pride. This is possibly one of the most sexist and racist images I've ever seen in my whole life.
Honestly, it's very striking because it is so racist and sexist at the same time. We have, like, obviously these African people depicted as savages, and they're attempting to
sacrifice a woman to a snake.
Yeah, a white woman, and there is a white man there to save her and kill all the black people.
With a single handgun, a single pistol. Not only that, this white man is the only person civilized enough to wear pants. Like, this is, you might think this is a small detail, but the only person wearing clothes in this image of any kind whatsoever is the man, the white man. And this tells you a lot about what white men think about humanity and who the civilized ones are. Definitely white women are not included in that. They are meant to be prizes that are won and fought for, but not to actually do anything but stand there with their tits out. And again, obviously Frank Francetta, he's drawn other pieces that do not have these kinds of connotations that are more empowering, but the fact that he was making this kind of art, and the fact that he had such a huge influence on the Conan the Barbarian brand, and the fact that these kinds of hypersexualized images of women and native women are still being used to this day, well, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth, doesn't it?
It does, especially because seeing all his other artworks, like, a lot of those images were empowering towards women and showed women kind of in, like, more strong roles. To be reduced to this damsel in distress.
Now, obviously, Frank, he was a commissioned illustrator, so he would make pieces for people and do what the people wanted him to do, but the artist is speaking through their work at all times, and all things that they do are done through their expression. This is something that he expressed, and these kinds of hostile and dehumanizing expressions are so frequent and so frequently used against native peoples, and it's time for us to stop allowing that. I personally think that Marvel did the right thing because this is a legacy of caricaturization, a legacy that is harmful.
I think he did the right thing in changing the way she was dressed in a way that was not so sexualized and also not so offensive.
I'm shook because I love sexualized depictions of women, but it's hard to justify it, you know? And, like, I want to be like, you know, it should be allowed, but at the same time, like, when you think about all, like, there's just so much context, right? Like, of course, when you think about it, like, at the surface, like, it doesn't seem that bad. But when you really dig into it and go through all the paces like we just did, like, it's impossible to justify.
I feel like sexualization, there's nothing wrong with it. It's when it's hypersexualization that there's something wrong with it. And that usually pertains to, like, a group that is, like, a minority group that's not usually, like, represented. Or maybe someone young that shouldn't be sexualized. Like,
naming them after Pocahontas, who was raped as a young girl by white colonizers, like, that's terrible.
Come on, that's really twisted. And as we saw from this fantasy artist, there are right and wrong ways to do it. There was plenty of art he had that was, I felt like, there was plenty of art that I saw that I felt like wasn't problematic at all, and in some ways represented women in an empowering way, even though they were being sexualized. And I felt like the sexualization was fair, but then
right.
that
you
other
can see why
image,
women like my mom, who are artists, admire his work. But you can also see why Native American women hate that shit and don't want to be seen or portrayed that way. If you made it through this video, consider subscribing to Higher Level Gaming to always find out when we post political videos just like this one. We mostly talk about video games, but not always, and this was one of those not always times. What do you think about Aaron's work? Did you read Scalped or any of his stuff? Do you think only Native Americans should write these kinds of stories that are so central to their culture? Or do you think all is fair when you're dealing with art? I'd love to know your opinion down in the comments below. Don't forget to have a nice day and go read some comic books.